we have been discussing about the intricacies of the Employees Provident Fund Act and the confusion which has resulted in various High Court and Supreme Court litigations, which is not at all concluding. Still the confusion arises with all employees. Even the HR professional, the legal fraternity is confused with regard to the various terms used under the Employees Provident Fund Act. As I told in the earlier session, the Act has failed or omitted to define what is wages under the Employees Provident Fund Act. If you closely look at the definitions of the Provident Fund, it doesn't define what is wages, because contribution is payable to wages. But unfortunately, the Act doesn't define wages, but it has only defined basic wages. Here the basic wages, along with the reading of Section 6 of the EPF Act, only will come to a conclusion that the contribution is payable to basic wages, dearness allowance, but it does not include bonus, commission, HRA and overtime and any other similar allowance. As a result of the confusion of the definition of basic wages and contribution under Section 6, the employers throughout India tend to bifurcate the salary into various components and contribute only to a lesser percentage of the total salary, not even 50% of the total salary. As a result, the purpose and the object of the Employees Provident Fund Act, which is a social security legislation, is defeated. The employer is trying to minimize the employer's contribution of 12% by bifurcating the salary to his own convenience and contributing to a lesser basic and dearness allowance, and bifurcate the salary into different components, namely various allowance, shoe allowance, food allowance, canteen allowance, overtime allowance, special allowance, food allowance, etc., etc. All allowances are bifurcated into the fancy of the employer. If you look at the reason behind a bifurcation of the salary, it is nothing but a process where employer is trying to evade the liability on the side of the employer. Otherwise, there is no meaning and there is no regulation which prescribes the wages should be bifurcated. The reason being because the Act failed to define the term wages. It is again over a period of 52 from as on today, the Act has failed to define what is wages. I don't understand the reason behind not defining wages so that the process could be simplified. It is not an exaggeration to say even the Supreme Court, while interpreting the legislation, the recent Supreme Court decision has failed, I don't say it is failed, has not given a direction to the appropriate government to redefine the term basic wages into wages so that the entire process of confusion that is carried on can be simplified. In fact, that is an omission on the part of the legislature, because any legislation for the purpose of ESI, Provident Fund, gratuity, any legislation defines the term wages. I think HR fraternity should have a look at the term wages. You don't find the term wages, you will find a term basic wages alone. But the contribution is payable to not basic wages. Contribution is payable to basic wages and a combined reading of Section 6, which will arise that it includes basic and DA, but does not include overtime, HRA, bonus and commission and any other similar allowance. This any other similar allowance has created a lot of interpretation by the High Court and Supreme Court. Another important definition which everybody is concerned is excluded employee. The EPF Act doesn't apply to excluded employee. Excluded employee has been defined under section, not under the EPF Act. Excluded employee has been defined under the provision under the Employees Provident Fund Scheme of 1952, it defines excluded employee is a person whose salary is above 15,000 as on today, but the salary is not defined under the Act. It says a person whose pay is above 15,000 is an excluded employee. But the pay has not been defined under the Provident Fund Act. It defines only basic wages. So what is pay? The Act says pay is basic plus DA plus retaining allowance plus basic plus DA plus retaining allowance plus cash value of food concession. So in other words, almost all industry which we are coming across, it includes basic and DA alone. The retaining allowance applies to very few industries where off-season employees are retained, allowance are paid, and cash value of food concession, very few industries are paid. So as a result, the term basic wages or section 6 of the contribution under the EPF Act has no relevancy to decide the excluded employee under the EPF Act. Excluded employee is whose pay is above 15,000 rupees. My dear friends, you should distinguish the term basic wages under the EPF Act, and while the term exclusion is emphasized, basic plus DA has to be taken into account. But the fact remains that HRA will not be counted for the purpose of exclusion. But for the purpose of EPF contribution, all employers tend to bifurcate the salary into an HRA, maybe 20-25% to evade the contribution, because the Act specifically excludes contribution of 25% HRA, not 25% HRA is excluded. But when you exclude an employee under the EPF scheme, that HRA is not taken into account. It is basic plus DA only is taken into account for the purpose of exclusion. So exclusion, the excluded employee is a very important term. So this is one condition. Number two condition is, if an employee after attaining the age of 55 years have withdrawn his accumulation in the Provident Fund Act, then he is also an excluded employee. An employee who is covered under the EPF Act and who has withdrawn his accumulation after attaining the age of 55 years is an excluded employee. That doesn't mean an employee who is not covered under the EPF Act, say for example a government employee where the Act doesn't apply, section 16, where the Act doesn't apply to a government department, not government company, government department. And an employee who has retired after the age of 55 years from the government department is not an excluded employee, even though his provident fund accumulation is withdrawn and even though he is drawing pension as a social security measure, which is also a great lacuna on this side of the legislature, which has not been patched up so far. Because an employee covered in the EPF Act has withdrawn his accumulation after 55 years is excluded, because the legislature thought after attaining the age of 55 and after withdrawing the contribution, the social security of that employee is not the concern of the state. But the legislature has ignored the fact that a person who is getting social security from the government department after attaining the age of 55 retired, joining an EPF covered establishment, he is not excluded and he will have to necessarily be enrolled under the EPF Act. That is all here.